Okay, big program today. John King is right over there. Good morning, Mr. King, sir.
Good morning, Peter.
All right, and we have special guests on the phone. We have Shane Morigeau, who is online too right now, and then Jenny Eck, who is visiting with us from Helena. Both of you online. Luckily, we have 4 lines.
Yeah,
so.
We also have Susan Weber, I believe, on line 3,
All right.
also representative.
Wow.
So we've got quite a show here. I guess it's kind of hard to juggle all of these different options right off the bat. Maybe the best thing would be to set the table at first.
Yes.
And give a little bit of background. If you haven't been paying attention to the news, we have a situation here in Montana where there was a fountain in Helena that was put up by the Daughters of Confederacy about a century ago, and there was a letter that went out in Lee newspapers that was written by Shane Morigeau, basically requesting the removal of that fountain. And I guess maybe we'll start there. Shane, if you could just give us maybe a quick summary of what you wrote.
Sure, yeah. So we submitted a letter, and myself and members of the Montana Indian Caucus for the state legislature submitted a letter basically just calling upon the Helena City Commission and to remove the Confederate monument in Helena, mainly because, looking at the historical background of the time and taking into consideration all the history that was going on at that time. We learned that was the early time in the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. It was the Jim Crow era. And it was, to my knowledge, it's still the single sole Confederate monument in the Northwest. And so we sent a letter just saying, asking the Helena Commission to recognize the harmful message that it sends to Montana Indians and minorities of our great state. So we asked them to take it down, and I know there's ongoing discussions about what to do with it now and whether to refurbish it or different options. But really, I think this is. I know a lot of people have strong feelings one way or the other, but I think one of the greatest things that we've seen from this is a discussion about history and really what I've been trying to do is to get people to talk about all of our history, to be inclusive and talk about what all of these things mean to, different groups of people and minority people and Montana Indians.
Can you explain that viewpoint for us? So what was the purpose behind the Indian Caucus being behind it? If you could kind of give us some viewpoint from that collective.
Sure. So, from my perspective, and I won't speak for all of the Indian Caucus since they're not on the line, and I believe Representative Weber is. She's from the Blackfeet Reservation. But, to us it represents divisive memorabilia. If you take things in context with what's going on in history today and what Confederacy memorabilia and signage and so forth have been used for throughout history, it's essentially it's been used by white nationalists and the Nazis, alt-right groups, for hate and separatism. And so, to us, that's what it represents. But it also represents a little more than just that to Montana Indians, because Montana Indians, a lot of people, I think need to take into consideration what the Civil War represents to American Indians. And, the Civil War and its aftermath resulted in essentially the near annihilation of Indians throughout the West. And we really just don't think that should be glorified or romanticized. We don't feel like we should romanticize the deaths of, thousands and thousands of people, blacks, civilians, American Indians, and certainly not represent the almost near extinction of the American Indian in Montana. So,
did you feel did you feel that that particular fountain stood for those things?
I feel that the fountain itself is representative of that. The Daughters of the Confederacy that commissioned it, we know that in 1915, The Birth of a Nation came out, which is known as one of the most racist films in history. And the Daughters of the Confederacy was openly supportive of the KKK. I don't know if you've seen recent articles that have came out in the Billings Gazette and Lee Enterprises documenting the early rise of the KKK in Montana, which was right around that time frame as well. And so, that to us, you look at what it represented historically, Confederacy, and saying we as a society, saying it's a nostalgic sense of tradition, I think we have to look at what that tradition represents. It essentially represented a group trying to secede from the United States because they wanted to own people, who had different colors of skin. And today, we see the same memorabilia being used to represent racism and separatism as well by neo-Nazi groups and stuff. And I think I should point out one important thing is that I know for myself and a lot of other minority people, we don't think everyone who has an opinion about the monument, we don't automatically register them and say, oh, you're a racist or you're a neo-Nazi because you want to see the monument stay. I think what's most important is that we're trying to teach people is all of our history and to create a better understanding of what these things represent to minorities and to people of color and Montana Indians, and to get a full piece of history of what was going on. And I don't know if I mentioned this yet, but at the time that statue or fountain monument was commissioned in Montana, it was the assimilation era. It was Jim Crow. It was allotment era. So a lot of tribes were having their lands removed from them still. Kids were being taken and put into boarding schools. And we know that hangings were still very, very relevant and going on as well. So, I think if you just take all these things in the context, you have I just hope people look at our history with a more complete perspective. And maybe people will never understand how we feel when we see those things or what those things mean to us. But the best thing we can do is try and teach people our history and the way it makes us feel.
And let me, I kind of wanted to backtrack a little bit and offer some perspective. Just as someone that has read it, I don't have, family members that are from any particular tribe that I know of. But when it comes to the Civil War, it's my understanding that there were tribes, not only tribes that owned slaves, but tribes that sided with the South during the Civil War. Some tribes that sided with the South during the Civil War that didn't have slaves, that thought that the North would be more of a worrisome partner when it comes to giving the tribes their individual freedoms. And this particular monument in Helena, as far as I know, there's no language praising necessarily the beliefs of the Confederacy, but it was more of, at least the statement that I've read of when it was put into place, a memorial for those that died during the Civil War. It's a memorial that was commissioned, or, the fundraising was done by the Daughters of the Confederacy. The actual sculpture was done by an individual whose father was on the north side of the battle. He's also the architect that did the, I think it's called the Placer Museum, or
Placer.
the place.
Placer.
Is it Placer?
Yeah.
The Placer Hotel, now the Placer Condominiums,
right,
in Helena. Fairly well-known Montana artist and architect. And I guess I get the sense that this particular memorial didn't necessarily stand for some of the racism that it is being accused of. And I was hoping maybe you could give me some bright lines as to when something from history should be taken down and when it shouldn't.
Tell you what, Shane, we're up against our first break. We'll do that about every 10 minutes. So can you hang on, you and Jenny? And we haven't heard from Susan yet. So we have one line open. If anybody from the public wants to call and share their opinions, give us a call. This is Talkback. We'll be right back in just a moment. We're back on Talkback. 721-1290 is our number, 1-800-568-5309. We have three guests on the phone. We have Shane Morigeau, who's a representative legislator here from Missoula. Jenny Eck is talking with us from Helena, and Susan Weber is also on the line. So you had just asked a question, John. So
yeah, I was basically adding some more historical context to the conversation when it comes to the tribes across the country. Of course, Montana tribe's fairly isolated from the actual Civil War, as far as I know. but there were, of course, there's lots of different nations inside the United States that fought on both sides of for the North and for the South. So it's a mixed history, just like our own history is mixed when it comes to that particular war. And I guess I find it difficult to have a unified perspective on that era coming from the tribes. And I was hoping maybe, Shane, you could comment on my comments there and maybe add some of those thoughts about bright lines when it comes to taking out historical monuments.
Sure. Well, I think it's important that we not everything be consumed in a vacuum here. I think, when we look at Confederate monuments and what they stand for, we know that what it represents is what those individuals and all the history has identified this, that the main reason for the war was for slavery. And now, there was a push early on in history to kind of try and change that historical context, that it was for states' rights and all these various things. But what the papers of the time and what the war was really about, when you do the research on all that, was it was about slavery. It was an important piece of the South's, identity at that point in time. And so, you asked the question essentially that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially that, if Indians were on one side or the other, yada, yada, if Indians were on the Union side or the Confederacy side, how does that change things? Well, I think you also have to keep in context that, slavery, no matter who is fighting on either side, slavery is wrong, and if a monument was put into Helena for someone who was fighting for slavery as a native, I would feel the same way about it.
Now, do you feel that this monument represents the virtues or the values or the character of the Confederate South, or could it simply be a fountain to memorialize those who died during that war from the South?
Yeah, fair, and that's a fair question. I think if you look at history and that snapshot in history of what was going on and the push by the Daughters of the Confederacy across the nation to put up monuments, there's actually a really great chart out there that identifies the uptick in Confederate monuments. And the two times in history where we have the largest uptick in monuments going up was during the Jim Crow era, right in this smack dab in this era when they were making a push to commission these, and the Civil Rights Movement. And so at those two times in history, you see a major uptick. And so I think when you take things into context, you look at history as a whole, you consider what was happening to American Indians, you consider what was happening to blacks across the country and other people of color. My understanding was there was a very large group of Chinese immigrants living in Helena at the time. You don't see any discussion or history from other minorities or people of color who were living in Helena at that time in history. And so essentially what I think is, people of color got cut out of that discussion at the time because when you look at what was going on in history, it was a very separatist, segregated, and hateful time. And you see that through the late teens and then the early 20s, huge growing of the KKK. And so I think when you look at history and time and what was going on then, when they put it up, I think you kind of find out that you learn very quick of the intent. And
right. Hold on, Shane. I know that Jenny can't be with us for terribly long, so I wanted to, Jenny, if you want to chime in, please go ahead.
Well, I would chime in. I'm also in the legislature. I'm a minority leader in the House, and Shane and I both serve in leadership together. And when I received the letter from the Native American Caucus, it's something I took very seriously, not just as leader of my caucus, but also as an elected official, also as somebody from Helena, and also as somebody who, thinks about these things and is trying to ask hard questions of myself. And I think, in going through this process and watching this process unfold in Helena as far as the fountain goes, one thing that has struck me as really, really important is that for those of us who aren't people of color, I'm white, I'm Caucasian, I have not lived that same history. It's really important for us to listen and to be maybe vulnerable to how hard this conversation is, but to be present with it anyway. And I was really struck by that when we had the hearing here in Helena about the fountain and whether to take it down or not, that there was sort of a lot of comments about, well, a fountain's just a fountain, and, it doesn't mean anything more. And I don't know that we get to say that. At least I don't feel that I get to say for everyone, this doesn't mean anything more. Because clearly for groups of people it does, and it means something scary, and it means something threatening, and it means it's a symbol of exclusion rather than inclusion. So I think when it comes to the Confederacy and the people who died in the Confederacy, I think we can remember those people and remember that history without commemorating it, and that's different.
Now,
and I think, sorry.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you. So there are tribal members. As far as I know, the Cherokee basically had an internal civil war during the Civil War. So there's family members of Cherokee Nation that fought with the South, family members that fought with the North. Choctaw, Creek Indian tribes fought with the South, and many others as well. So there's some that would view this memorial for Civil War dead, even from the tribes in other parts of the country, that would see it as not necessarily some horrible evil from their past, but a family memory, perhaps, of those that fought and died.
Yeah, and I think that, like I said, I think we can remember what happened. I think we have a duty to remember what happened and to know as much about it as possible. I think there is a line between remembering and commemorating, and I guess I would also just add, I don't think there's any accident that the KKK and the neo-Nazis of today have taken that symbol and used it as their own. I mean, we have to recognize that Charlottesville did change the landscape significantly, and that is now a part of what we're grappling with. And clearly, as a country, we have a lot to grapple with. We still have a lot to deal with from our past, and for us to say, well, it doesn't mean anything, or these symbols don't mean anything, or, only interpret, that symbol in a specific way that feels more comfortable, and not recognize all the other ways it could be represented.
Okay, Jenny,
I think it's a missed opportunity.
Okay,
it would be a missed opportunity.
Okay, we're going to take a break. We apologize for that. Susan Weber is also, although we haven't had a chance to hear from her yet, also Al is waiting to make a comment. So we'll try to get them all in. We'll take a quick commercial break, and we'll be right back. 721-1290 is our number, 1-800-568-5309. Having a great conversation about the Confederate Memorial that has been taken down in Helena. I really want to get Al's call on. Let's see. This would be right here. Al, thank you for holding, sir. You're on Talkback. What's your thought?
I'm on a talk show radio out of Missoula.
Okay. Susan, hang on just a minute. I can't silence you right now. So, Al, go ahead. What's up?
Did I hear, Shane, did I hear you correctly saying that slavery was the main reason for the Civil War?
That's what he said, yes.
Okay, because slavery was not the main reason. States' rights, by far, was the main reason. Slavery was one of other reasons, but it was not the main reason. The reason I called in, 4 days after your article was in a Missoulian, someone else wrote in pointing out something that you left out in your article. I guess you stated that Native Americans fought for the Union. And this other person who wrote in stated that his figures came from the National Parks Service. And he says that 3,500 Native Americans fought for the Union, 15,000 fought for the Confederacy, plus there was a general on the Confederacy. That's a 4-to-1, over a 4-to-1 odds of Native Americans fighting for the South instead of the North. I just wanted to know if you knew that in your comments.
Yes, as a matter of fact, he's already mentioned that. And we are up against our hard break. I am so sorry to do this. Shane and Jenny, we're going to say goodbye to you. I know you have to leave, but thank you for being on the air with us today, okay?
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. And we're going to come right back. Stay with us. We have another hour of conversation here on Talkback. So if you want to be a part of it, give us a call at 721-1290, and we'll be right back. Okay, we are juggling lots of phone lines here this morning. We're having a fascinating conversation talking about the Confederate fountain that was taken down several weeks ago and the commensurate conversation that's going through that. We have Shane Morigeau, is a legislator from Missoula. We have Susan Weber, who's also on the line, and Shirley is also joining us. So, and of course, John King, and I'm Peter Christian. Go ahead.
Now, Susan's actually been online for about 30 minutes.
Yes.
Maybe we should give give Susan a chance.
I think it's a great idea. So, Susan Weber, tell us about yourself and where you're calling from today.
Oh, good morning. Susan Weber, House District 16, Glacier County. I'm calling from Browning, Montana, Blackfeet Indian Reservation.
Okay, so as you've been listening to the conversation, Susan, I know you wanted to chime in. So what would you like to share with us today?
Oh, it was just the monument. Well, first of all, something like that shouldn't be in Montana. But as an Indian person, we face, like, racism. We deal with negative stereotypes all the time. That's our life. And then if we can do a little something, then that's great towards, removing some of that stigma or that racism or perceived racism. And that's great for us.
Let me ask you this. You said something like that monument shouldn't be in Montana, but you do recognize that a large number of families that were part of the Confederate South after the war went westward. Many of them ended up in Montana. A large number of Montanans came from the Confederacy. So there is a history of the Confederacy in Montana. To be frank, prominently in the formation of the Democratic Party of Montana.
Well, there was probably no Indians in there. Montana Indians, I should say.
Possibly. I don't know. But regardless, it's not just about Indians here, right? It's about all Montana.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you have.
And I'm just the voice. I guess I'm just speaking from the voice of the Native American. At this point, I represent a large portion of my constituents are from the Blackfeet Indian Reservation, and our history isn't that pretty, and that anything we can do to dispel any type of racism or any connotations towards racism is good. It's a positive step forward.
Well,
we live with that all the time.
Well, let me ask you this, Susan. There's been many prominent Montana historical figures that have been at odds at times with the Native Americans in Montana. I mean, prominently, Thomas Marr.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think statues of Thomas Marr should be taken down?
At this point, we're talking about...
Or perhaps maybe Marr County might be renamed. Is that something that you would think would be appropriate?
Well, we're talking about this one particular monument. I mean, that's where this discussion started.
Oh, okay,
right?
All right.
Actually, my first question was, can we lay down some bright lines as to when a monument should be removed and when it shouldn't? Because I think it's a very important question going forward.
Now, Shane, you were trying to say something a second ago. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I don't think we consume everything in a vacuum. Of course, like this fear of all of a sudden people are going to want to take down all the monuments. Every person has a negative history. I mean, I think I think it's important to get back to what is important, and it's keeping things in context. We know what the Confederacy stood for then. We know what it stands for now. We know what people are using Confederate memorabilia for today. And I guess, John, I'd pose a question back to you.
Yeah,
you say that there's a lot of Indians in the Confederacy and the Union. First of all, Indians were fighting for survival. Indians also fought on both sides in the American Revolution.
Sure.
And so Indians at the time were fighting for survival. Now, like I said earlier, if someone is fighting for slavery, I don't care who it is, slavery is wrong. But we also have to keep things in context. What was the Civil War about? Now, the gentleman that talked about, that called in and said the Civil War wasn't about slavery. That's very, very untrue. And this is why we need to be having discussions about history. We know it was about slavery. There's a great article and video from Colonel Ty Soodle, who's the head for the Department of History for the West Point Military Academy, and he breaks this down. He gives all the historical context. I would recommend to that gentleman to go and watch that to get the colonel's perspective, an accurate historical perspective. You can simply Google that and watch the video of the colonel talking about history for the Civil War and the fact it was
Shane.
And we know, and when I say keep things in context, let's keep things in context. What was going on at the time in 1916? What was going on in 1915? We know that The Birth of the Nation had just came out. Again, a silent film depicting the Confederacy and the KKK, basically as memorial, basically saying, they're coming in to save people. And then you go fast forward through 1916 and then the early 20s, KKK and the rise in Montana. And so when you look at a snapshot in history, and I guess, John, if you think that was for, and I'm not saying you think this, but your question, what if it's memorializing Indian soldiers who fought for the Confederacy?
Mm-hmm.
Is essentially what I got out of your. Okay,
sure.
Where were all the minorities and the Indian families for that honoring? Why weren't they invited? Why is there no historical discussions from these different historians about Indians coming to that memorial?
I think it's a great question, but the absence of a voice for Native peoples when it comes to memorial fountains in Helena doesn't negate or necessitate the removal of this particular fountain. I don't see why one justifies the removal of the other.
Well, I think when you say absent of one, I actually would probably say there's a large absence of.
And by the way,
Indian
I wouldn't say
a lot of our history, especially when you go back to when I was in high school, going back to the Indian Wars.
Mm-hmm.
The cowboy was romanticized and Indians were savages. That's how it was laid out to me when I was in high school. And history obviously has changed in Montana. We have Indian Ed for All now. And so schools, are making a lot of progress in that area. And I still think we have a lot of progress to make on this front. But I guess I don't agree that, this argument, I guess, to me, of Indians in the war fighting on the Confederacy side automatically is this like red herring in my perspective.
Well, why is it a red herring? It's historical fact that this happened. The actual fountain in Helena says nothing about any values of the Confederacy. The only thing it says is that it was placed there by the Daughters of the Confederacy. In the speech, when they dedicated the fountain, they said it was to memorialize those who died. That would include the Native American tribes that fought.
Okay, folks, we need to take a break. I'm sorry, I'm kind of the commercial sheriff. So we have Shirley and Marilyn who both want to chime in on the conversation. Shane Morigeau, Susan Weber joining us. We're talking about what happened in Helena with the removal of the Confederate fountain. We're going to come back and continue this conversation. Even though our lines are full, you're welcome to make your comments on our Facebook page. We'll be right back. And we're back on Talkback, 721-1290. I'm KGVO. I'm Peter Christian. That's John King over there. And we also have all four lines are humming. So, Shane, you are officially a Talkback all-star, sir.
A rock star.
I just want you to know. All right, I promised we'd get some of our callers on, so let's do that right now. Shirley, you're up next. You are on with Shane Morigeau. Good morning. Go ahead. Shirley.
Yes, good morning.
Go ahead.
Couple of things. Now it's hard to keep my thoughts now. First, I want to note that there are plenty, as Susan said, there are plenty of things that are offensive to people in the world. You simply have to turn your head and keep going. You can't change history. But along with that, there are a lot of Indian monuments in Montana that are offensive to many of us. For instance, the dead medicine tree south of Darby. That is preventing widening that road and making it safer along that river for everybody that travels that road. So there are issues for them also. And they have plenty of voice in Helena that stops the road from happening because they have a monument there. So, and about slavery, the Indians took many slaves in their lifespans too. And I agree with the man that called in. The war, Civil War, was not about slavery. It was not. No matter what they say in the medias today, it was not about slavery. It was state rights.
Can I ask you a question? If you would be so willing, go and read the cornerstone speech by the Vice President of the Confederacy. He gave the speech, basically it's supposed to be the cornerstone of what is the foundation of that particular grouping. And he lays it out that it is about slavery. It's impossible to say that slavery is not a key component of what they meant when they were talking about states' rights.
Well, that was an issue of it, but it was not the cause. It was not what put them into the war, because the South people did want to keep their slaveries, and the Constitution did speak against it. But it was up to the states demanding their right to make their own choices.
All right,
Wish
Shirley.
there was more of that today. Thank you
Shirley,
very much.
Thanks for the call. We're going to try to get as many calls in as we can. Marilyn, you are on Talkback. Please go ahead.
Oh, as usual, there's always so many points to hit on. So, to me, okay, Shane says he wants to talk about all of our history. Well, to me, I've never been able to understand why Indians and blacks have been voting Democrat all these years when it was the Democrat Party that was the party of slavery and did not want to get rid of it. And they were the ones that put up the Confederate flag and didn't want to vote for the rights of the blacks, and they were the ones that most of these statues that were put up by Democrats, and that it's the Democrats that have they're guilty of the racism of low expectation of the Indians, of the blacks. It was Woodrow Wilson that played the birth of a nation in his White House, and yet there's monuments to Woodrow Wilson all over the place. I mean, let's learn our history, and, it's the Democrat that has the motto to, move forward Montana. Well, instead, they want to keep looking backward, and to me, I think, Shane, seems like to me you should be spending your time getting the Indians off the reservation. That's where they are in prison there. They should be taking part in the prosperity of America instead of staying on welfare and this prison of alcohol and drugs and fighting. And I don't understand why
All right.
you're still Democrat.
All right. Now, Marilyn, you said a lot. So let's just, Shane, I want you to go ahead and respond to that if you don't mind, because she mentioned you several times. Please go ahead.
Sure. And I think, when you go back into history and you look at the switch over and why blacks started voting Democrats, we had a very important switch on important policy issues during the Civil Rights era. And I've seen a lot of discussions and about this. And at a point in time in history, blacks and minorities saw a switch in a party where it felt that one particular party had turned their back to blacks during the Civil Rights movement, and that's why you saw that switch. Now, you go back into history and were these Democrats at the time, that a lot of these policies and ongoing things were, historically, that's accurate, but when you look at what was going on throughout history and how you saw that actual swap over and how that changed. So I think that's important. And you probably know that, but you omitted it. So, and I think, there was a lot of stuff going on in that comment. I think socioeconomic conditions are a product of a lot of policies. Tribes are trying very, very hard to we are at the bottom of every social indicator, and we try very hard to do business. We try hard to get policies to give us equal footing on creating businesses and pursuing businesses and economic development. When people say social welfare, I find it offensive because welfare exists in every government, and the state of Montana has social programs to assist people and help them dig themselves up out of poverty. Just as Indian tribes get funding and programs to help assist with the same thing. So I think it's a little closed-minded when people say those types of things, because it means we have a lot of work to do to teach them about tribal government still. And I think, we're seeing those changes and that input at our K-12 educational programs. We need to do a better job of making sure people aren't perpetuating essentially stereotypes on and on throughout history. So the high number of prisoners directly linked to poverty, low-income places. You see that in any community, whether it's white, black, Indian. Higher rates of poverty tend to result in higher incarceration rates. And so, tribes, like I said, I know that every tribe in Montana cares about this passionately. We care about our people, and we want to see them do well and succeed in life. And so, yes, we are trying to find and effectuate changes to that effect to make their lives better.
Okay. Shane, I'm so sorry. We're up against a break, so we're going to come right back. We also have Gina, Hunter, and Mark, who also want to visit with you. It's a great conversation. Open up lines of communication. We'd love to hear from you. And if you can't get through on the phone, you can make your comments on our Facebook page. We're coming right back. Hey, we're back on Talkback. 721-1290 is our number. And Shane, I know that you wanted to make another point before we went on to our next caller. So please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. It seems like one of the things that I keep hearing is, Indians had slaves at one point. George Washington had slaves at one point. Thomas Jefferson's current kin actually, there's a great article by one of his, I think, great-great-grandchildren, great-great-great-grandchildren, whatever it is, talking about, the fact that, we should be teaching that history. We should talk about that kind of stuff more. It was a different time in history, though. It wasn't a war, as John so eloquently broke down, that the war was about slavery. And experts on this, including the historian for the West Point Academy, has said that. That's what it was about.
Hold on. Go ahead.
So, of course, I do actually agree with part of your argument, but I think there's a system of logic that I don't fully agree with you on. And I wanted to show you what it is real quick. So there's a big difference between a sign and the thing signified. And it seems to me you're jumping to conclusions about what a thing signifies outside of a historical context. The question at hand is this fountain in Helena. That's the immediate question. I think there's a bigger question about future monuments and statues to other historical figures. And if we are attributing extra meaning to this Helena fountain, I'm worried that we might start attributing extra meaning to every statue. I mean, that's why the issue of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and even Abraham Lincoln come up. It's because if there isn't a bright line for when a statue or a fountain or a memorial needs to be removed, then I think we're at danger of erasing parts of our past unfairly. When it comes to this particular fountain, it's difficult for me to see this historical racist meaning. I could just as easily read it as a unification of North and South. You have a Northern son helping to build the fountain. You have the Daughters of the Confederacy paying for it. You have a public place in Montana where they had a new home. If you read the original speech, it says nothing about owning slaves or necessarily racism. And I guess it's difficult for me to put all of this historical significance that you're adding to the fountain when I just look at the history. And when you do your argument for putting this on there, you talk about a movie, which I don't even think we had a movie theater in Montana that could have played it. You add other things from around the time, but things that happen in tandem don't necessarily aren't consequential to each other necessarily.
Well, I guess that's where I would disagree with you is taking things in the context again, looking at the time in history. This didn't go up right after the Civil War or during the Civil War. Obviously, Montana didn't even exist at the time of the Civil War, but we did have soldiers that came over. But if you take things in the context, a snapshot in history, we know it was Jim Crow, we know it was allotment era, and you say that the person giving the talk about why this is such a nice thing. I mean, that's the whole point that I guess we are trying to get people to understand. And
Georgia Young is
do my best to that. You know, if you take context to history at the time, like there's the put up the Confederate monument, and there's a memorial there in town, and a person, just because a person says something doesn't have a meaning, right? And I guess my discussion with folks is, okay, where was the discussion about how this is representative of unity and peace with all minority people at the time? We know, if you take a snapshot of history, what was going on at that time, that these particular monuments were going up by this organization throughout the country during the Jim Crow era and also during the Civil Rights Movement. And so I think, you know, I'm trying to do my best to express how those things make us feel. And I think if you take context to what it meant then and what it means to people now, and how Confederate memorabilia continues to be the sign for neo-Nazis and used for those purposes. I guess, for instance, one of the reasons the Helena Commission came in and said, you know, we need to take this down immediately, because we don't want it to be a rallying point for these organizations. We don't want it to be a place where protests are happening by right-wing neo-Nazi organizations. And I have to say that, and I have to point out, too, that I think it's really great that just a few months ago, we dealt with Klan rallies in Whitefish, Montana. And we had alt-right, white supremacist organizations coming in that wanted to march down the street, assuming that a lot of them would probably wear swastikas and wave Confederate flags while they do that, as we've seen in Charlottesville and other places. But I think it was great that our state came together, and we had our congressional delegation of Senator Tester and Senator Gaines and A.G. Fox, Bullock, and Zinke, and everybody came together and said, hey, we don't want this in our state. We don't want these organizations here. And so I think I understand what you're saying, John. I guess I wouldn't agree with that perspective, because I think when you actually take history into context, what was actually going on when they put that monument up as well, and what it's represented throughout history, and what Confederate memorabilia continues to represent, I think that signage and those memorials basically send a message to Indians, a very, very negative message to Indians as well. So remember where you came from. Remember who you are. You know, it's like something pointing you in the face, telling you're lesser than us. Okay.
Well, hang on just a second. Let's get a caller in before we need to take a break. Okay, Shane, hang on. Gina, you're on Talkback. Please go ahead.
Yes, I would like to bring to the attention to everyone that the Council of American Islamic Relations, which is a Hamas-related terrorist group and the legal and political arm of the Muslim Brotherhood, sent a template to all 50 states to remove anything that had the Confederate flag, Confederate monuments, and any symbolism of white supremacy. Well, just to let you know that back in Senate Bill 97, CARE also sent a letter to the House Judiciary Committee to get rid of the bill that would have banned foreign law out of our Montana court system. And I overheard, because I gave testimony on that day, I heard Shane say, I heard the word assimilate in testimony, and as an American Montana Indian, the word's synonymous with genocide. We have a problem here when we have useful groups, including MERN, the ACLU, Southern Poverty Law Center, and Social Justice Collaborative, and the Indian Caucus going along with CARE, the Council of American Islamic Relations. This group is nothing more than to take down our U.S. and Montana Constitution. And until we understand the red and green axis, which the red being the Marxist and the green being the Islam, and Islam is Islam. I don't care which way you put it. There's no moderate. There's forget the extreme.
Gina, real quick, I got to go to a break. So wrap up your point.
My point is, Shane, you're being used. And the problem is that you're going to have to pick But I think it's shameful, and I think that you're a subversive.
All right,
and
all right.
We need to.
I'm sorry, Gina. Thanks for your call. We're going to come right back. Shane, I want to give you a chance to respond to that, and also give you plenty of time when we come back from the break. Okay, so we have Hunter and Mark also at a line open, and Facebook, and we'll continue in a moment. Okay, we're back on Talkback. 721-1290 is the number. And, we just had quite a conversation there with Gina. And so I know, Shane, you wanted to go ahead and respond to what she had to say. Go ahead, please.
Well, sure. The whole breakdown of care and supporting this organization, I guess I don't even know how to respond to that because it's just, it's made up. And I guess maybe she's saying that the unintended consequences of us advocating for that sole statue monument removal somehow makes us associated with them. I think that's very, very out there. I think our intention is to bring a fuller discussion of history that represents all people in Montana. And something that represents all of us in places like that. So I think an important point to make on that is that we know what the purpose of monuments are. The Confederate monuments, General Custer, General Robert E. Lee, those types of monuments is to basically illustrate and provide an illustration of power of one group of people over another. And so
you think all the monuments that have any Confederate person on them, or even just a tribute to the Confederates, like the monument in Helena, stand for exactly that? I that's what I have a hard time making myself do. I feel like you're jumping to conclusions here. There are American cemeteries with memorials to those that died on the South. By the way, some of them, as we mentioned earlier, happen to be Native Americans.
Not only that, Shane, but if I remember correctly, I think it was I believe in the early 1900s. Didn't Congress go ahead and make an act to say all Confederate soldiers were declared as veterans of the United States? So I mean, at least somebody was trying to make peace there. You know what I mean? And it just seems like the more we stir this up, the more hatred comes to the top. Is it possible to skim that off or not?
I think so, and I think that's why it's important for us to be having these exact conversations we're having right now. Like I said earlier, the Civil War and its aftermath resulted in the near annihilation of Indians throughout the West, and we don't think that should be glorified. And like I said earlier, romanticize the deaths of thousands of people, blacks, civilians, American Indians, and it was a time that is something that represents almost the near extinct American Indians. So, I think we need to have these conversations, and we need to have conversations about other. I agree with you, John. It's not. We don't just come in and never has anyone ever said that. At least from the group that I've worked with on this particular monument, none of us have ever said it's time to take down everything in Montana that has some sort of poor meaning to people. But I think when you take into consideration the context of what this represented then and now, I think it's a easy conclusion, at least for us, as to what it represents as far as racism and separatism. And I think those communities and like I said, we can't consume everything in a vacuum. Every monument and history, there's history to everything, and there's a purpose for everything. And I think when you look at the history and the purpose of that at the time that it was put in and what it currently represents today, I think the conclusion is easy for me anyways, but I obviously respect people's opinions, and I enjoy having this discussion with people, because I don't, if you have a discussion about whether you think that is history, I think people sometimes get history confused with heritage. And we know heritage is noting or relating to a product, a place, etc., which is supposed to evoke a nostalgic sense of tradition or history. And history is a whole series of past events that connects with someone or something. And so I think when you look at what these mean as far as heritage, I don't think that is our heritage here. I don't think our heritage is racism or hate. And I think we've made leaps and bounds in that area. And I think we still have a lot of work to do. I think we need to keep having these discussions.
Okay.
I hope we continue to have these discussions that talk about these things.
Shane, I want to get another caller on before we take a break, okay? So, I'm sorry to interrupt. Shane, I'm sorry. Hunter, you're on with Shane. Please go ahead. You got about a minute.
All right. I just wanted to say that, I think no one just wants to admit the hurtful, purposely inhumane acts that continue to create social conflicts. And, again, slavery, racism, Civil War, it was purposely done. Native Americans living in poverty, living on reservations, was purposely done. Native Americans live in poverty today because they were forced not to practice their traditions, culture, and history, and not to practice their natural way of life. That's why they live in poverty. So people like Marilyn would believe the way that she did. Now, Civil War, the reason why they were Native Americans on both sides of the war was because, like Gina said, they were used. So as a professor of mine said, we live in a creative system, and the creative system was created by certain people to benefit the creators of the system. So,
okay. Hunter, thanks for the call. We got to take a break. Shane, I'll let you comment on that when we come back. Mark and Dave are also joining us. John King is over there. He's just jumping. I want to talk. So we're gonna all get into this conversation. We have like 20 minutes left in the hour. We'd love to have you be a part of it, and we'll be right back after this. We're back on Talkback. Really a great conversation going on. Shane Morigeau joining us this morning. He's a legislator from Helena. And just getting ready to go back to his office here, as a matter of fact. But our phone lines are full. Now, John, you wanted to say something. Please go ahead.
Let's go I'll defer to callers.
To callers. Okay. Let's see who's up next. It's Mark. Whoops. Okay, stand by. Just a minute.
We're still learning how to push the buttons after all these years.
I'm sorry, John. Okay, Mark, you're on Talkback. Go ahead, please.
Ed, good morning. First of all, erasing history is not a good idea. I think that succumbing to this national hysteria we've got going is not good. And I think Native American activists would be better served to not destroying statues of history, but raising statues of history of some of the great Native American philosophers, shamans, and warriors that fought against the cavalry in those days. Now, those warriors are taught about and revered in our National War College. They're still discussed today.
Shane, I think our caller makes a good point.
Thanks for the call.
You have mentioned many times that you want to see more, but in your letters and in your argument for removing the Helena Fountain, nothing was suggested as far as a replacement.
Sure, and yeah, I think that's a good comment as well. I appreciate that caller's comment. I think it's important to note that because this particular monument has been taken down, it doesn't erase history. I actually think if you look at history of the monument itself, 2 years ago there was a vote to come up with a context and background on what that represented. And there was a lot of discussion about having the history represented on a plaque, discussing slavery at the time, and what was going on, to give it context of what was going on at the time. And it just never happened. And so I think my position on it has been, I think it's actually a great opportunity for the community to have this discussion like we are right now, to talk about what should happen there. They've talked about basically refurbishing it or recreating it to represent it there and give it, true background in history with the monument. They've talked about reconditioning it to bring a different message to it. I think that's a discussion that the city of Helena, that's the city commission and the residents that live there. At the end of the day, that's really going to be a decision they make. I think they have a subcommittee that's already working on that. But I think obviously if I was asked, I'd be happy to chime in and give my input. But I also think it's a great opportunity for all Montanans to kind of come together, have this discussion, and put something there that is representative of all.
That's what we're trying to do today. Let's get Dave on the line next. Dave, you're on with Shane. Go ahead, please.
First, about the statue. I object to the way it was the process. I think there should have been a more open public process for the decisions made, and I think we could have done better on that. As far as the Civil War goes, I believe it was South Carolina who left the Union when Lincoln was elected. He hadn't even taken office yet, and he was well known nationwide as an anti-slavery person, and other states followed it, and that's the process there. They kind of made up about states' rights later.
All right, thanks, Dave.
Yep.
Yeah, Abbeville is Abbeville, South Carolina, is where not only the South decided to leave the Union, but also where the Confederacy died. Interesting distinction.
Okay, let's get Doug on the line. Doug, you're on with Shane Morigeau. Go ahead.
Hi, Shane. Doug May. I got a couple questions, and if you could answer them for me, I'd really like to get your thoughts on them. A few minutes ago, you were talking about the different Confederate generals that, I guess you find offensive and stuff, and then you threw General Custer in there. So do you find General Custer offensive?
Do I find General Custer offensive?
Yeah.
I think history has accurately...
No, I'm not asking. Do you find him offensive?
Personally.
Do you personally?
Do I personally find him offensive? I find General Custer representative of...
No, not representative. Do you personally find him offensive?
Well, if murdering and attempting to murder and remove Indians from agreed upon lands and landscapes, then yeah, I would find that offensive.
Okay, so then let's go back a little bit. Do you find the Indian generals who pushed other tribes off their lands, do you find them offensive?
If Indian generals were fighting for slavery, if that
like the Blackfeet, do you look at the Blackfoot tribe? Do you look at the Blackfoot tribe as offensive?
Do I look at the Blackfoot tribe as offensive?
Yes.
I think I look at that question as offensive.
They're what?
Well, he says he finds your question offensive, sir.
You find your question offensive.
Your question.
This is the problem. See, no. Listen. Why is Hellgate?
Hold on, guys. 5 seconds. Let's give each other a time to talk. So first, we're going to defer to the caller. We're going to defer to the caller first, and then we'll get your response. Okay, Shane?
Go ahead.
Okay. Do you find the name Hellgate Canyon offensive?
Shane?
Shane?
Yes.
Do you find the term? Do you find the term Hellgate Canyon offensive? That was his question.
Apparently this individual is trying to put together a stream of questions of things that may or may not be offensive to Indian people. But again, I think the questions are offensive because to try and corner people on having a discussion about something being in itself straight up answer of something offensive or not, I think totally eliminates the complete context and discussion of different things. I think if you talk about what General Custer was attempting to do and when he lost, I think nowadays people talk about the history of that and they talk about what happened with General Custer and how he, what his mission and what he was set out to do. I think talking about and asking a tribal member from another tribe if he finds another tribe offensive is bizarre to me. I guess I don't get the series of questions.
I think what he was trying to say is the various individual tribes weren't always friends, right? Is that correct?
It just depends on the time,
okay,
place, and era.
Yeah,
but
I was just
today. What I consider giving context to what's going on today, I have a lot of very good friends from Blackfeet Reservation. I have very good friends from every reservation in the state of Montana, and so I think the argument on whether we found something offensive at one time takes away from the whole. The point of one of the major points of this discussion is giving context to what something meant then, what it meant at a snapshot in history in the early 1900s, and what it continues to mean today.
I think that you actually kind of agree with the caller, Shane. I think his broader point is that there are people living in Montana that are descendants from the Confederacy.
Sure.
And simply because you find this fountain offensive based on, I don't know, extracurricular readings on history that you apply to the fountain. Some of us have difficulty attributing the same values to the fountain that you do.
And that's okay. That's the exact problem, because the ethnocentric perspective, a closed mind, like, because a value isn't like somebody else's. It's interesting how that works, because a value isn't the same as someone else's. It all of a sudden has to be the value is inaccurate, or the perspective is inaccurate. And so that's exactly the whole point of this discussion, and the discussion of this Confederate monument is the values of the time, and the discussion, the perspective that you gave earlier, where the person was, they gave a historical background of what it meant to the people and what the person said at the time. It completely there's no discussion about what was actually going on in history at that time, what was happening to American Indians. And I think Hunter had some very good comments as well earlier, when he was talking about the fact that American Indians who were fighting in many of those battles were actually fighting for existence, for survival, because they were a lot of them were fighting to be not exterminated, essentially. And then when you actually look at what happened after the war, a lot of those resources were turned against American Indians. And so, and I've made that point several times. And
with that, Shane, I'm so sorry. We're going to take a 1-minute break, then we're going to come right back. And there's lots of people who still want to visit with you. We're going to come right back with more Talkback in 60 seconds, so don't go away. Okay, we're back on Talkback. We have about, only about, we got late into that break, so we have 4.5 minutes left in the program. Now, Shane, I interrupted you to take the commercial break. So did you want to finish your thought before we get to some more callers?
Oh, I mean, I'd like to hear from more callers, actually. I think.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, let's get
all right,
more.
Here we go. Here we go. All right, Mike, you're on Talkback with Shane. Go ahead.
Okay, Shane, here it is. This requires a yes or no answer. As you know, 2 years from now, we're going to be doing a census of the United States of America. Should we remove all references to nationality, religion, or color, and just count people and call it, say, U.S. citizens? That's all we want to know, because I always mark Native American, so I want to hear whether yes or no, should we eliminate that and just put a census? How many people live
Mike,
there?
are you actually Native American?
Hell no. Yes, I am a Native American. I was born and raised here. If I'm not native to the United States, then where the heck am I native to?
All right, Mike. So Shane, a little comic relief here. So go ahead. What do you think?
So, Mike, it sounds like you checked Native American, even though you're not American Indian, which I think that is what that actually indicates. And so it sounds like it's at least the census prior one is skewed by one person. But I guess my question to you, Mike, would be why would you recommend? I mean, I would assume that you're asking the question because you recommend that, or you believe that's a position that we should take. We should just say no race or color, and everyone just marks that they're Native. Native American.
How about human being would be a good one? Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess. That to me, I guess, Mark, I appreciate the question, and clearly throughout history, recognizing that there's different races and identities has been core to our values as American people. Adding to the so-called melting pot of different perspectives and backgrounds and cultures is what makes us Americans. What makes us Montanans, all the tribes that are here. So I guess I wouldn't agree that we should eliminate who we are, because my identity it comes along with my culture and my language, and that's who I was born as. I was born as a Salish and Kootenai Indian.
I'll tell you what, Shane. Forgive me. We have exactly 2 minutes left in the program. So rather than try to get some more callers in and getting into a big discussion, I want to give you the last minute and a half here just to state your case. Shane Morigeau, the reason you're on the program today was to try to get what point across to our listeners?
Sure. And John, I think we had a very good discussion about this today. I think it's to kind of open people's minds and to think beyond, what your own personal values are, for one thing. And of course, it goes for everybody. We need to be open-minded and have discussions with one another, because I think when we have these discussions and people, automatically they put up walls and they think that they're being labeled because they have one certain viewpoint. And that's not the point of this. The point is to have discussions about different things and points in history that is inclusive of all of us, having a discussion about what it represents to everybody, and recognizing what the purpose of monuments are. So I think with that, I think it's been a great discussion. I think I appreciate everyone's input that's been on the radio. I think there were some harsh words at one point, calling me a subversive at one point, which I actually think is not very nice. But at the same time, I think the person and the individuals I talk to, I think we need to treat each other with respect and have these conversations openly about our history and not attack one another, because I think a lot of times... Shane,
I hate to cut you off. I'm sorry. We are out of time. Thank you so much for being with us.
You're welcome back anytime, Shane.
Yeah, thanks a lot, John.
Take care. All right, what's coming tomorrow? We have open phones?
Well, I don't know. We might have your guests.
We're trying to get some guests.
I don't know.
You guys have a great day, and thank you for the discussion. You guys have a terrific day.